was a dull and overcast morning in the village of St. Aldhelm's Hollow, when the housemaid of Elderbury Hall screamed loud enough to rouse every bird in the garden. She had entered the library to draw the curtains and found Sir Geoffrey Carraway, slumped forward on the desk, his head resting on a scatter of papers, his skin as pale as the snow that dusted the grounds. The letter-opener, a slender silver dagger gifted by his late wife, was embedded in his upper back, piercing through his dressing gown. The coroner would later suggest it had been driven in while the victim was seated, the force sudden and precise. The room was locked from the inside. That was the first puzzle. The key was still in the lock, and the windows were latched tight. No signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, and no hurried footsteps in the hall. Just Sir Geoffrey, alone and lifeless in his private sanctuary, surrounded by the comfort of mahogany shelves and a faint scent of pipe smoke. His butler, Mr. Finch, had reported hearing nothing unusual during the night. The house had been calm, as always. Sir Geoffrey, an early riser and meticulous creature of habit, had reportedly gone in after supper and not been seen since. The police were summoned promptly, and the local inspector, a steady man named Cornish, arrived before noon. He examined the scene with practiced patience. Nothing had been stolen, and Sir Geoffrey's watch and wallet were untouched. The only item of apparent interest was an unsigned letter found beside the body, typed neatly on the hall's own stationery, and bearing a single signature scrawled in blue ink at the bottom. Annabel Carraway. But Annabel Carraway had died 3 years ago. The inspector, puzzled but cautious, noted the signature and set it aside. He could not yet say whether it was a clue or some melancholy remnant. The letter's content was vague, almost poetic. A single paragraph that read, "I forgive what you did, Geoffrey, and I shall rest now. But not before justice returns to Elderbury Hall." It bore no fingerprints, except Sir Geoffrey's own. Suspicion did not fall squarely on anyone in the household. The staff had been with the family for decades, most of them elderly and fiercely loyal. Sir Geoffrey had no living children, and his only regular visitors were his nephew Henry, a solicitor from London, and a local historian named Miss Blythe, who had been cataloguing the library archives. Both had been seen leaving the estate before nightfall the day before. The locked room suggested suicide at first, but the wound's angle refuted it. It had been delivered by another hand. That left murder, but how had the killer entered and exited without trace? No footprints, no tampered locks, no creaking floorboards overheard. The case was already slipping into local legend by afternoon. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Wendell, who insisted that Miss Marple be called. "Not because the police aren't doing their duty," she said with the conviction of a Sunday sermon, "but because Miss Marple has the sort of mind that sees through the fog of things." And so the invitation was sent. Miss Marple arrived. The following morning, umbrella in hand, wearing her usual expression of mild curiosity, touched with a faint trace of disapproval, as though someone had forgotten to put the kettle on. She was greeted cordially by Inspector Cornish, who knew her by reputation, and given full access to the library. She examined everything: papers, bookshelves, dust patterns on the floor, even the inkwell on the desk. Her eyes lingered longest on the signature. "Tell me," she asked the inspector gently, "has anyone verified that this handwriting is Annabel Carraway's?" Cornish frowned. "Well, we assumed." "Assumption," Miss Marple murmured, "is often the most direct path to error." She requested samples of Annabel's known handwriting, diary entries, letters preserved in the drawing-room desk. They were brought to her within the hour. For several minutes she sat comparing loops, tails, pressure points. Then she asked for something unusual, a fountain pen and the signatures of every member of the household, including the servants. One by one they were summoned and handed a clean sheet to write the name Annabel Carroway in their natural hand, followed by a second attempt with the opposite hand. She thanked each of them with polite detachment, except the butler Finch, to whom she gave a curious look. When the nephew, Henry Carroway, arrived that evening, having rushed in from London upon hearing the news, he showed every sign of sincere grief. But Miss Marple observed his gaze lingering on the desk drawer where the estate documents were known to be kept. A solicitor would know precisely which papers to look for and how quickly such papers might change hands after a death. Sir Geoffrey was a stickler for signatures, Miss Marple remarked idly to Inspector Cornish. He kept detailed records of all documents requiring witness or attestation. That desk drawer should reveal what he had been reviewing before his death. Inside were several items: a land deed, a revised will dated only 4 days prior, and a sealed envelope labelled, "To be opened in the event of my unnatural death." It was unsigned, but beside it lay a small blotting pad. Miss Marple lifted it carefully and held it to the light. Faint impressions remained, the sort that only the gentlest hand might leave behind. She requested a mirror be brought and pressed it against the pad to reverse the imprint. A few seconds of scrutiny revealed a few letters, then a signature. It matched the forged one on the letter, but the pressure points differed from Annabel's hand. They were too slow, too careful. Someone imitating. Miss Marple turned once again to the servants' samples, and then her voice, quiet but firm, addressed Inspector Cornish. "Inspector, I believe we are looking not for the person who wanted Sir Geoffrey dead, but for the person who wanted him shamed." Cornish blinked. Shamed? Indeed. Consider he was stabbed while reading what he must have believed was a message from his deceased wife. A message of forgiveness that turned to vengeance. A cruel trick, designed not merely to kill, but to unnerve. Someone recreated her signature, but not well enough. "But it's a locked room," Cornish protested. "No one could have come or gone." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That's the other trick, you see. One does not always need to leave to commit a murder. One can stay quite hidden, especially if one is already part of the background." She turned to the fire grate and pointed to a barely visible smudge behind the coal bucket. A servant's hiding place. Someone could have waited here, quiet as a shadow, after placing the forged letter. Sir Geoffrey reads it, is shaken, sits down, and then, she mimed a sudden strike, and then our butler, Mr. Finch, returns to his duties unnoticed. After all, what is a butler but part of the furniture? Finch was summoned again. He denied everything. But his left-handed attempt at the forged signature was identical to the one on the letter. The ink in the desk well bore microscopic traces of silver, a rare detail matching only one pen in the house, Finch's, which he kept in his own drawer. Faced with the evidence, the old man wept. He had been Annabel's brother. Disowned, shamed, and dismissed years before she died. He had served Sir Geoffrey silently for years, waiting, and when the moment came, he signed her name with trembling reverence, then struck, not for gain, but for revenge. Miss Marple said nothing as he was taken away. She merely turned to the desk, straightened the blotting pad, and whispered softly to no one at all. "It is always the details, isn't it? The things people overlook. The following morning brought with it a brittle frost and a renewed hush over Elderbury Hall, as if even the air itself was hesitant to disturb the crime that had occurred within its walls. The authorities were busy cataloguing evidence, speaking to staff again, and sorting through papers as per their procedures. Inspector Cornish paced the hallway with a notepad tucked beneath his arm, muttering about motive and method. Yet even as order and process took shape around the crime scene, it was evident to some that a full understanding of what had happened remained just out of reach, like smoke curling around the truth, but never quite touching it. Miss Marple remained seated in the library, her gaze fixed not on the dramatic but on the ordinary, a broken thread in the carpet, a half-burnt match lying near the waste bin, a slight shift in the angle of a framed painting over the fireplace. These were not the sorts of things others considered relevant, but to Miss Marple, they whispered, of quiet actions taken in haste. She had long understood that most evil did not arrive with trumpet blasts, but crept in under cover of silence and routine. She asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Herring, to recall the layout of the library as it had been the previous morning. Mrs. Herring, a sharp woman with a mind for symmetry, explained that the book on Greek architecture, which now lay open on the side table, had been tucked neatly away the day before. Miss Marple ran a gloved finger along its spine. It was a heavy volume, one unlikely to have been consulted casually, let alone by Sir Geoffrey, who rarely read anything more taxing than the Racing Times. Yet there it sat, page turned to an engraving of a Roman column flanked by ivy. She said nothing, merely closed it gently and replaced it where Mrs. Herring remembered it had originally been shelved. A maid arrived to dust the corridor and paused with a nervous glance toward the drawing-room where the family had gathered. Miss Marple watched her with that polite softness that belied a needlepoint mind. When the girl hesitated before stepping in, Miss Marple approached quietly. "You were the one who found the body, weren't you, dear?" The maid, Alice, nodded stiffly. "Yes, ma'am. You must have been frightened terribly. But tell me, did anything seem odd to you? Anything at all?" Alice looked uncertain. "Only that the lamp was on." "The lamp?" she pointed. "That one on the desk. Sir Geoffrey never used it. Said it made his eyes ache. Always used the overhead lights or the window during the day, but that lamp, it was on when I walked in." Miss Marple murmured her thanks and let the girl return to her work. She moved to the lamp in question, examined the cord, the bulb, even the dust along its base. One edge of the cord showed a smear, darker than dust, possibly wax or polish, possibly something else. Inspector Cornish returned just as she was rising from her crouch, raising an eyebrow. "You've taken quite a liking to that lamp, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "I find that light, in certain hands, reveals far more than it conceals." He gave a quiet chuckle and updated her. "We've ruled out all points of entry. No tampered locks. No hidden passages. The windows are secure. Either someone was already in the room, or Sir Geoffrey let them in willingly. And there's no sign of forced entry." "Quite," she said. He hesitated, then added, "There is something that troubles me, though. The letter." She tilted her head slightly. "It bothers me that it wasn't hidden. It was left right there, plain as day. If it was meant to unnerve him, wouldn't it have made more sense to leave it where he'd find it later, perhaps in a drawer, not out in the open?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Unless it was never meant to be read at all. Unless the killer wanted the police to find it." Cornish frowned. You think it was left as a misdirection. I think it was. A performance. And every performance has an audience, even if only one person was meant to see it. Which brings me to a peculiar observation. Have you noticed the ink? She moved to the writing desk and opened the drawer again. Inside, several pens rested in a velvet-lined compartment. But only one had fresh ink, a deep indigo that glistened even in shadow. Sir Geoffrey always used black ink. His letters, notes, even his crossword puzzles. He didn't like colour, claimed it was the mark of the showy and the sentimental. This pen, however, is not his. It has no matching companion among his set. And the handwriting, though close, was traced over more than once, likely to simulate uncertainty, perhaps even emotion. Cornish said nothing, but his frown deepened. Just then the front door opened. A tall man in his early 30s entered, shoulders squared, with the slightly dishevelled look of one who had taken the earliest train he could. This was Henry Carraway's younger brother Daniel, an artist often away on exhibition work in Europe. He had been unreachable the day before, but returned quickly once he heard of the death. Miss Marple noted how his eyes darted not to the body, nor to the inspector, but to the side table, the one with the architecture book. His face twitched almost imperceptibly. Then he turned and feigned a startle when he spotted Miss Marple. "A dreadful shock," he said, and his voice was even. "He was always kind to me in his way. We didn't agree on much. He thought art was a waste of time, but he never turned me away." Cornish shook his hand. "When did you last see Sir Geoffrey?" "About 2 weeks ago. I came to show him a portfolio. He dismissed it within 2 minutes. Said something rude, I'm sure. I hardly listened. I left before supper." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "You wouldn't happen to recall whether that book was open then, the one on Roman design?" He followed her eyes, and for a moment, just a flicker, his hand twitched by his side. "No idea. Geoffrey wasn't much of a reader." "But you are, I imagine," she pressed gently. "An artist with a taste for form." Daniel's lips thinned. "I suppose. I'm not sure what that has to do with anything." Miss Marple smiled. "Only that it's very rare for people to open a book and turn it to a specific page unless they're looking for something, or hiding something." She walked past him, brushing her fingers along the edge of the open volume. Then she turned, the page back one and another, until nestled flat against the spine was a small photograph, tucked tightly into the fold, almost invisible. It showed a younger Annabel sitting in the elderberry garden, laughing, her hand resting gently on Daniel's shoulder. Inspector Cornish took the photograph. "This isn't part of the household collection." "No," Daniel said quietly. "It's mine. I took it years ago." "And how did it end up here?" He hesitated. "I brought it back with me. I'd been meaning to return it. I suppose I left it here by mistake." Miss Marple's expression didn't shift. "Or perhaps you left it where you thought Sir Geoffrey would find it, on the very night you returned quietly and waited in the shadows." Daniel stared at her, expression faltering just enough to betray the edge of a mask. Miss Marple's voice dropped lower, calm as snowfall. "You loved her, didn't you? Annabel. And he married her. And when she died, it wasn't just grief. It was fury. Because even in death, he still had what you never could." Daniel looked down, lips parted, but no words came. His fingers trembled. Cornish stepped closer. "We'll have more questions, Mr. Carraway." Miss Marple said nothing further. She simply returned to her chair, folded her hands, and let the silence stretch around her. A silence that listened. A silence that saw, and within it, the first layer of deception had begun to peel away. Daniel Carroway was led to the study under Cornish's quiet authority, but his silence clung to the walls long after he had gone. The photograph Miss Marple had uncovered, once thought insignificant, had slipped a new thread into the fabric of the mystery. It was no longer just a question of how Sir Geoffrey had been killed, but why so many of those close to him had chosen silence as their first response. As the clock ticked on in Elderbury Hall, Miss Marple asked that all members of the household, both staff and family, remain available for further questioning. And so, one by one, the voices of Elderbury began to speak. The first was Henry Carroway. He sat with his back straight and his tone clipped, the manner of a man accustomed to boardrooms and legal briefs. "I've never had much patience for theatrics," he began. "My uncle was a difficult man, yes, but he wasn't hated, not enough to justify—" This, Inspector Cornish nodded slowly. "Where were you on the evening of his death?" "I left just after tea. Had an appointment in London. Stayed overnight at the club." Miss Marple's eyes did not leave his face. "And you didn't return unexpectedly during the night, perhaps to retrieve something?" He gave a polite, almost weary smile. "Certainly not." Yet Miss Marple noted how his hand twitched slightly at his cuff. A reflex, or a concealed discomfort? "What do you think of your brother's return?" she asked gently. He hesitated. "Daniel's always been volatile. Not in any violent sense, of course. But he lets emotions guide him. He resented Geoffrey for reasons I've long since stopped trying to understand." "Did he love Annabel?" "I don't see how that's
relevant. But you do believe he did?" Henry paused again, then gave a short nod. "Yes, though she married Geoffrey, Daniel always behaved oddly about her. Distant and yet protective. Did Geoffrey know? I imagine he did, but—"
He rarely acknowledged what didn't serve his version of things. He was dismissed, and Miss Marple leaned back, thoughtful. She had seen no direct lie, but she had certainly not seen the whole truth either. There was a formality to Henry, a carefulness, as though every word had first passed through a filter, designed to remove anything compromising. The next to appear was Miss Blythe, the local historian. She arrived in sensible shoes and a patterned shawl, with a nervous smile that fluttered as she took her seat. "Miss Blythe," Inspector Cornish began, "you've been cataloguing the library for several months, I understand. 8, to be precise. Sir Geoffrey's family archives are extensive. Did you see or speak with him the day he died?" "I left around 5 o'clock. He was in the drawing room speaking with Mr. Finch." "Did he seem agitated?" She paused. "Tense. He'd been reviewing some old letters, some from Annabel. I believe he was distracted. Told me to close the project for now, said we'd resume next month." Miss Marple leaned forward. "You're sure the letters were from Annabel?" "I didn't see them closely, just the top one. Her handwriting was quite distinct." "Would you say you're familiar with it?" "Oh yes, I've transcribed several of her personal diaries. Her hand was quick, elegant, with a slight upward slope, very unlike the forged signature we found." That comment caused Cornish to raise an eyebrow. "So you believe the signature was forged?" "Undoubtedly. Whoever wrote it tried to imitate emotion but produced hesitation instead. It was strained, Not her at all. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And may I ask, Miss Blythe, why were you cataloguing personal items such as Annabel's letters rather than simply historical texts? Miss Blythe shifted in her seat. Sir Geoffrey allowed it. He said he wanted the full history of the estate, even the personal bits. But only recently? She hesitated. After Daniel left the country last year, he seemed more open to documenting the past. That answer caught Miss Marple's attention. And what changed when Daniel left? Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps Geoffrey felt safe. The words hung in the air like dust motes catching morning light. Miss Blythe was dismissed, but her final remark echoed in Miss Marple's mind. Safe. It implied something unspoken, something Geoffrey had feared. Perhaps not violence, but exposure. Finch, the butler, followed next, looking pale and polished, though the signs of recent interrogation had left faint strain around his eyes. You were close to the Carraway family, Cornish began. I served them 30 years, sir. Closer than blood, perhaps. You were also Annabel's brother, Miss Marple added softly. He stiffened slightly. Yes. Did Geoffrey ever speak to you about Annabel in those later years? He avoided the subject. I obeyed. That was our arrangement. But you kept her photograph, Cornish said, hidden in a book. He swallowed. I had no intention of harming him, not really. I wanted him to see her again, to remember. I placed the photo in the book and left it there days before the murder. Nothing more. And the letter? Miss Marple asked gently. Finch shook his head. Not mine. I wouldn't mock her memory with forgery. Someone else wanted him broken. I only wanted him haunted. His words rang with sincerity, and Miss Marple, after a long pause, nodded. Then let me ask, who knew you had that photograph? Only Daniel. Years ago I showed it to him in confidence. He begged me to keep it. And if he'd wanted to use it, manipulate it, he could have. I never told Sir Geoffrey I had it, but Daniel knew. Finch was dismissed, and Cornish folded his notebook shut. That's 3 people now, he said. Each with a reason to hate Geoffrey, each offering partial truths. Miss Marple nodded, and yet only one of them lied in silence. What do you mean? Henry. He deflects, plays the dutiful nephew. But his description of the club, he mentioned it almost too quickly. He was setting an alibi before we even asked. You think he returned? I think he was close. Perhaps close enough to see the lights still on in the library. Close enough to know Daniel had slipped in, perhaps by arrangement. Cornish frowned. And what would that prove? That there were 2 crimes, one of murder and one of silence, and that both may yet reveal different culprits. Miss Marple rose. She moved to the library window, looking out toward the gardens where snow had begun to fall again, light and whispering. She pressed her fingers to the cold glass. Someone here knows more than they've said, she murmured. And when a person speaks too clearly, or not enough, it's often the spaces between their words that give them away. The snow continued to drift in slow spirals beyond the library windows as Miss Marple sat once more in the armchair closest to the hearth, her knitting unused on her lap, her mind threading a far more intricate pattern. The air in Elderbury Hall had grown heavier, not with grief which had already given way to suspicion, but with something more brittle, more dangerous. A sense that each word spoken now served less to illuminate than to conceal. Every suspect had revealed just enough to suggest motive, yet none with enough clarity to place the knife in Sir Geoffrey's back. And that, Miss Marple knew from long experience, meant the truth lay not in the obvious, but in the overlap. Daniel Carraway had motive etched into his very posture. His art, his sister-in-law, his family name, all had been shaped and broken by Geoffrey's hand. The photograph tucked away in the Roman architecture book had not been forgotten by accident, nor planted with carelessness. It had meaning, personal and deliberate, yet Daniel's return was so immediate, so brazen, that Miss Marple couldn't help but question it. He had returned almost as if to be found. It was not the behavior of a man hiding a murder. It was the behavior of someone placing themselves near the center of the story, but just outside the final act. Henry, by contrast, was almost too composed. Miss Marple reviewed her mental notes. A solicitor, methodical, unshaken by the news, and keen to establish his alibi with rehearsed precision. His disdain for Daniel was palpable. His motives, financial perhaps. The revised will in Sir Geoffrey's drawer, still sealed and unopened by anyone before the authorities arrived, could very well have cut him out or reduced his share. He had the most to lose, and perhaps the clearest means to fabricate distance. But would a man so careful make a mistake like returning unnoticed? And then there was Miss Blythe, a local historian with no family ties, no inheritance at stake, yet so clearly entwined in the emotional atmosphere of the hall. She had known Annabel's handwriting intimately, had access to the library and Sir Geoffrey's personal effects. Her quiet observation that Geoffrey felt safe once Daniel had left suggested a knowledge of household tensions that went deeper than she had admitted. Perhaps she had grown close to Geoffrey, or perhaps she had come to resent the restrictions placed on her access to the estate's history. But to what end? Miss Marple rose from her chair and asked to be taken to Sir Geoffrey's private study, room separate from the library, where he kept his personal affairs. Mrs. Herring led her there with a hesitant hand, the door creaking open to reveal a cold room of brass fixtures and stiff leather. The fireplace had not been lit in days. On the desk, 2 blotters rested beneath a stack of correspondence. Miss Marple opened one drawer, then another, her gloved fingers pausing only when they encountered a small envelope labelled Daniel. "Do not open until I say." She examined the seal. It had not been broken. The paper was yellowed slightly at the edges, not newly written. Whatever message it held, it had been prepared long ago and then forgotten, or perhaps deliberately. Withheld, she tucked it into her handbag and turned to leave, pausing just as her eyes fell on a photograph frame turned downward on a low shelf. She lifted it carefully. Annabel again. This time not laughing, but seated on a bench, her expression still and thoughtful. Tucked behind the photo, folded tightly, was a receipt, dated 8 days ago from a print shop in London, for copying handwriting samples. Miss Marple's breath caught faintly in her throat. Someone had gone to considerable lengths to replicate Annabel's hand, and not long ago. She returned to the drawing room with the paper folded securely in her coat pocket and found Inspector Cornish speaking quietly with Finch, whose face was lined with exhaustion. She waited until the butler had stepped away before crossing to Cornish. "I believe we're chasing too many threads," she said softly. "What if we are looking at this the wrong way, not from the outside inward, but from the inside outward?" Cornish blinked. "What do you mean?" "Everyone had motive," she said, "but no one had singular motive. Each suspect fits pieces of the crime, but not the whole. Yet something binds them, something central." She took out the receipt and handed it to him. Cornish's brow furrowed as he read. "Someone had Annabel's handwriting copied," she said, and they did so a week before the murder. Cornish's eyes lifted slowly. Henry? He claimed no knowledge of forgery, but he's a solicitor. He would have noticed the discrepancy instantly. Yet he didn't voice any suspicion until others raised it. That alone is suspicious. Cornish nodded. Then what now? Miss Marple's voice dropped. Now we invite all three, Henry, Daniel and Miss Blythe, back to the library, and we let the room speak for itself. Within the hour they were seated once more. Henry stood near the fireplace, arms folded. Daniel leaned against the bookshelves, his arms crossed tightly. Miss Blythe sat closest to the window, gaze flicking between the others, fingers twisted in her shawl. Miss Marple began gently. There is a document I'd like to share with all of you. A receipt for handwriting replication, dated just before Sir Geoffrey's death. Someone went to great lengths to forge a message in Annabel's name. Daniel's face twisted in confusion, then unease. Why would anyone do that? To manipulate, to shame, to push Sir Geoffrey into emotional turmoil. And perhaps to provoke a reaction. Henry's eyes narrowed. Do you have evidence it was one of us? Miss Marple held up the envelope labelled for Daniel. Sir Geoffrey wrote this to you. It was never delivered. But I suspect it contains something important, something he meant to reveal. She turned to Cornish, who slit the seal and pulled out the contents. 2 sheets of paper. The first was a short letter. Daniel, you deserve to know. Annabel loved you. She told me before. She died. I never told you because I couldn't bear the truth. I've made arrangements to alter the will. I hope one day you'll understand. Daniel's breath hitched audibly. Miss Blythe's hand flew to her mouth. Cornish continued. The second page appears to be the original version of the forged letter, the one from Annabel. Henry stepped forward. That's impossible. That letter was found beside the body, unsigned. Exactly, Miss Marple replied. This is the first draft, the true draft. It contains no signature, and it never left the study. She looked to Henry. Which means the version found in the library, signed and sealed, was crafted elsewhere, then placed there later, by someone with access to both the study and the typewriter. Henry's face darkened. You're suggesting I'm stating, Miss Marple said calmly, that someone stood to lose everything if the new will were executed. Someone who forged a letter, planted it, and lured Daniel back here, knowing the emotions would cloud everything. She turned to Miss Blythe. But you didn't forge the letter. You helped. Perhaps out of misguided loyalty. Perhaps because you believed Geoffrey had wronged Daniel and the family, but you didn't kill him. Miss Blythe stood, tears welling in her eyes. I only wanted him to admit the truth. I thought if he read her words again, if he remembered what he'd done, and someone else used that moment, Miss Marple said quietly, to end him. With the letter in place, with the window of grief open wide. Someone seized it. Cornish stepped forward. Henry Carraway, I believe we'll need a full account of your movements the night Geoffrey died. Henry said nothing. But his silence was no longer the silence of caution. It was the silence of collapse. And in that stillness, Miss Marple sat back in her chair and allowed the tangled web to tighten around the one man who had built his life around controlling every thread. Inspector Cornish moved swiftly after Henry Carraway's silence. A quiet, Command brought uniformed officers into the room, and Henry, without protest, allowed himself to be escorted from the library. He didn't resist, didn't even glance at Daniel or Miss Blythe. There was no outburst, no plea of innocence. Just a dry mouth and tired eyes. The will was retrieved, and when opened, confirmed what Miss Marple had implied. Sir Geoffrey had made Daniel his primary heir, leaving only a modest sum to Henry. A motive, clear and potent. Combined with the forged letter and Henry's suspicious eagerness to present an alibi, the case seemed to have found its conclusion. The village murmured with swift consensus. Henry Carraway, the cold nephew, the meticulous solicitor, had cracked. Within hours, the newspapers had caught the scent of scandal, and reporters began circling the edge of Elderbury Hall like crows. Inspector Cornish allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. It wasn't just the evidence, it was the logic, the timeline, the motive, everything aligned. And yet, when he turned to Miss Marple later that evening, expecting her approval, he was met with a serene face that did not match his triumph. "You're unconvinced," he said. Miss Marple offered a soft smile, almost apologetic. "Oh, I do believe Henry has something to answer for, but not murder." Cornish raised his brow. "He had motive." "Yes," she said, "and pride and resentment, but not the desperation required to stab a man in the back. Henry was many things, but he was never impulsive. His kind prefers destruction through slow erosion, clauses, signatures, and sealed envelopes. He would have ruined Geoffrey legally, not physically." Cornish frowned, now standing beside the cold hearth, where the faint smell of ash still lingered. "But the forged letter, Miss Blythe confessed to helping prepare it," Miss Marple reminded him gently. "She believed it would force Geoffrey to admit what he'd hidden, his guilt, his cruelty." Henry saw the letter as an opportunity to expose his uncle's legacy as a lie. But murder? No. That moment required something else. A different kind of emotion. Cornish remained silent for a moment, weighing her words. "Then who?" Miss Marple's gaze turned to the library desk. The typewriter sat there still, untouched since the morning. Someone who understood the effect the letter would have. Someone who didn't just want Geoffrey gone, but wanted his final moments steeped in confusion, fear, and guilt. The murder was not about inheritance alone. It was personal. She requested again to see the library alone late into the night. The household had quieted. Daniel had gone to the guest room, refusing food. Miss Blythe remained in tears, her sense of shame a heavy cloud over her shoulders. Mrs. Herring had retired, and Finch, ever dutiful, ensured the hallway lanterns were lit before disappearing into the kitchen. Miss Marple, alone now in the room, where Geoffrey had drawn his last breath, moved with slow precision. Her hand hovered above the desk lamp. She examined the base again, where that smear of dark polish or wax had first caught her attention. She took a handkerchief and rubbed gently. Beneath the surface of dust was not wax, but something slightly sticky. Candle resin. Her eyes flicked up. The overhead light had not been used the night of the murder. The desk lamp, always avoided by Geoffrey, had been turned on. An anomaly. And if the killer had known Geoffrey wouldn't use it, they might have counted on that. She traced the cord to the wall. It was long, curled loosely around the back of the bookcase. Her fingers followed it, then paused. Behind the bookcase, nearly flush with the wall, was a second cord, much thinner, unplugged now. She reached behind and tugged gently. A small black device emerged. An old-fashioned dictation machine, portable. Taped to its side was a note. For transcription, Finch to type after supper. Miss Marple took the device to the sitting room where Cornish had settled with tea and fatigue. "This," she said, "is what we missed." Cornish turned the machine over in his hands. He wound the small tape with care and pressed play. The voice that followed was unmistakably Sir Geoffrey's, clipped and formal as ever. "If you're hearing this, then I suppose I've finally done what I feared. Let my pride kill me. I have wronged too many people. Annabel most of all. Daniel. He never knew. But I kept them apart because I could, because I was jealous of what they had without me. I burned the letters, lied, took what didn't belong to me." There was a pause, a cough. "The solicitor comes tomorrow. The new will is ready. I suppose Henry will be furious, but he'll recover. He always does. I just hope Daniel reads what I left him. If not, well, let the ghosts have their say." Cornish looked up. "This changes the tone completely." Miss Marple nodded. He wasn't angry. He was prepared, regretful. He expected the will to cause trouble, but he never suspected danger. Which means he was killed by someone he didn't fear, someone he let into that room, even after hearing that message to himself. Cornish's face hardened. "Finch," Miss Marple shook her head. "Finch heard that tape first. He was meant to transcribe it. He delayed. Maybe he didn't want the truth to come out. But Finch is too precise to stab a man in anger. He buried his sister in silence for years. He would never desecrate her memory with blood." Cornish exhaled slowly. "So we're back to Daniel." Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She stood and moved to the window. The snowfall had thickened. A quiet weight pressed against the glass, like the world itself was holding its breath. "No," she said at last. "Daniel left his mark in sorrow, not violence. His grief was visible, performative perhaps, but not deceptive. The person we've ignored is the one who never appeared to want anything, who asked no questions, who never offered an alibi because no one thought to question them." Cornish's mouth tightened. "Mrs. Herring?" "No," Miss Marple said, her voice now soft. "With precision, Miss Blythe." He blinked. "But she confessed to forging the letter. She confessed to helping. But it was her idea. She had access to Annabel's journals. She'd spent months immersed in that world, romanticizing their relationship. She came to believe Annabel was the victim of everyone, Geoffrey, Daniel, even Finch for his silence. She wanted to give her a voice again. And when Geoffrey dismissed her, cut off the archive work, shelved the project, Miss Blythe saw it as a second silencing. Cornish stared at her. "You think she killed him?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her eyes now distant with quiet sorrow, that she waited behind the curtain, perhaps in the corner, out of sight. She placed the letter, waited for him to read it, watched the guilt rise in his face, and when it didn't break him enough, she broke him herself. Cornish remained still for a long time. The victory they had declared hours before had felt real. But now, like a castle built on sand, it crumbled quietly under the truth, a truth that had hidden in plain sight, beneath the guise of grief and academic obsession. "Shall we bring her in?" he asked. Miss Marple shook her head. "Not yet. Let her think the case is closed. Let her feel safe in her righteousness. The truly dangerous do not strike with anger. but with belief. And she still believes this was justice. She turned back toward the fire, where the embers had burned low. "We must wait," she said gently, "because the story she's writing isn't finished yet." The hush that had settled over Elderbury Hall lingered through the following morning, disturbed only by the rustle of curtain ties and the quiet clink of teacups from the kitchen. The snow lay heavier now, as though winter itself had pressed down more firmly after the night's revelations. Inspector Cornish made no announcement. Henry Carraway remained in custody, and Miss Blythe walked the halls without suspicion, her eyes faintly rimmed with fatigue but her manner otherwise unchanged. She had resumed her place by the library windows, thumbing through the inventory lists she'd drafted before the murder, as if preparing to resume her work once the case had run its course. Miss Marple, however, was far from content to let the quiet resume. There was something unsettled in the dust of Elderbury Hall, not just in the motives, but in the history that clung to every room. She returned to the archive room, the annex near the east wing where Miss Blythe had spent months cataloguing old letters, account ledgers, family documents. The records had been left untouched since the investigation began. Finch unlocked the room for her without question, and Miss Marple spent the morning in silence, lifting one box after another, tracing back through the estate's past. It was not the large files that caught her attention, but a slim notebook tucked between two bound volumes. A catalogue Miss Blythe had made of unsorted personal correspondence. She turned the pages slowly. The entries were in her handwriting, meticulously itemized. Letters from the early 1920s, receipts from the war years, courtship letters between Sir Geoffrey's parents. But one entry caught her eye. Undated letter addressed to E., possibly Emily Carraway. Subject ambiguous. References to Annabel Emily Carraway, Sir Geoffrey's older sister, long deceased. A widow, once briefly engaged to a vicar who died tragically young. Emily had lived in the Hall's West Wing and had died nearly 20 years ago, quietly and without scandal. Her name was seldom spoken in the family, not out of shame, but forgetfulness. Miss Marple searched the corresponding box. At the bottom, beneath faded theatre programmes and pressed flowers, she found the letter. The paper had yellowed and folded over time, but the ink remained sharp. It was unsigned, addressed only as "My dearest E", and dated in what appeared to be the early 1940s. The voice was unmistakably feminine, sharp and intelligent, touched by bitterness. The content wasn't romantic, it was confessional. You were right about Geoffrey. He always needed control, needed the attention. But what he did to Annabel, I don't think she ever forgave him. He told her Daniel had left willingly, lied, told her he married another. He locked away her letters, made her believe the silence was her own doing. When she finally knew the truth, she was already ill. It ate at her. You said I shouldn't interfere, but I wrote Daniel myself. Long after she died, he never answered. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then once more. Then, her lips pressed tight, she folded it again and slid it into her handbag. By mid-afternoon, she had requested Inspector Cornish meet her in the drawing room. The fire had been lit, the warmth welcome after the stillness of the archive room. He arrived with his usual notepad, prepared for more speculation. Instead, Miss Marple handed him the letter. He read it in silence. When he finished, he asked, "You think Daniel knew?" She shook her head. "No, but someone else did." Someone who saw that letter during the cataloguing. Miss Blythe. Exactly. She wasn't just cataloguing paper. She was unearthing ghosts. And what she found shaped the story she wanted to tell. Cornish looked down again at the paper. So Annabel was deceived. Geoffrey kept Daniel away by manipulating her. And Emily, his own sister, tried to right the wrong. Miss Marple nodded. But she was ignored, or perhaps she kept it too quiet. The letter never reached Daniel. But Miss Blythe found it. That's the connection we've missed. Why she was so determined to recreate Annabel's voice. She didn't just sympathize. She believed she was giving voice to someone silenced unjustly, and that belief turned her obsession into action. But that's motive, Cornish said slowly. It still doesn't prove murder. It gives it shape, Miss Marple replied. The murder wasn't committed in a vacuum. It was a conclusion. A final chapter to a story Miss Blythe believed needed closure. And she thought herself the one chosen to close it. Cornish paced near the fire. We could confront her. Bring in a psychologist, perhaps. But the evidence... Miss Marple turned back toward the hallway. There is one more thread. She requested a visit to Miss Blythe's rented cottage just off the village square. The local constable arranged it, and by dusk, Miss Marple was standing in a modest sitting room lined with bookshelves and neat piles of paper. Miss Blythe welcomed her with faint surprise, but didn't question her presence. I've been expecting someone, she said, pouring tea without asking. Now that Henry's been taken, I wondered if there'd be more questions. Miss Marple accepted the cup. I came across a letter in the archive, written by Geoffrey's sister, about Annabel. Miss Blythe didn't blink. Yes, I remember it. You catalogued it, but you didn't submit it to the estate's formal archive. I kept it back, Miss Blythe said evenly. It didn't belong there. Because it was personal? No, she replied, her voice low and precise. Because it was dangerous. It told the truth. And I knew what would happen if it surfaced. It would be buried again. Daniel would remain in the dark. Geoffrey would remain unpunished. Miss Marple sipped the tea. So you wrote the letter? I channeled the letter, Miss Blythe said. I used her words, her voice, her pain. I didn't forge anything. I restored her. And when Geoffrey didn't react the way you expected? I waited, she said softly. I waited for him to be alone. He sat at that desk and read the letter. I watched him. I was behind the drapes. I saw the way he crumpled it. No remorse, just irritation, like it was an inconvenience. And that, Miss Marple said gently, was when you decided. Miss Blythe's hands rested in her lap. She died with his lies in her lungs. I wanted him to die with her truth in his. There was no confession, not in the legal sense. But Cornish arrived not long after, and Miss Blythe did not resist. She merely rose, took her coat, and followed him out of the cottage without a word. Miss Marple remained behind, the tea cooling beside her. She walked over to the writing desk and opened the drawer. Inside, beneath a pile of notes and family trees, was one last envelope. It was sealed, and the name written on it, Daniel, was in Annabel's unmistakable handwriting. Except this one was not copied. It was original. Untouched. She picked it up with care, then closed the drawer softly behind her. The past, long buried, had clawed its way back into the light. And in the silence that followed, the true cost of forgotten truths settled over the room like snow. The morning after Miss Blythe's quiet arrest, Elderbury Hall remained cloaked in a strange hush, like the aftermath of a storm that had passed without ever fully breaking. The snow outside had hardened into a thin crust of ice, crunching underfoot, as Inspector Cornish made his rounds across the grounds, ensuring statements were taken and lingering press inquiries brushed away. Daniel Carraway had left early, claiming he needed time alone to process everything. Finch resumed his duties, though his movements were more deliberate than before, as if the burden of so many years of silence had aged him overnight. Yet for all the tidy conclusions drawn around the hall, Miss Marple was still not content. She carried the sealed envelope found in Miss Blythe's cottage, the one bearing Annabel's original handwriting, and addressed simply to Daniel. It was heavier in meaning than in weight. It confirmed what they already suspected. Miss Blythe had not invented the story, only delivered it in a new, more theatrical form. But the presence of the real letter raised new questions. Why had Miss Blythe kept it sealed and hidden? Why not deliver it to Daniel if she truly wished to honor Annabel's memory? That restraint was inconsistent with the obsessive moralism that had driven her to commit murder. And that inconsistency unsettled Miss Marple more than anything else. She returned to the library with the envelope tucked inside her handbag. The room had not changed, books still dusted with frost, the faint smell of paper and ash clinging to the corners. She looked again at the desk lamp, then at the painting on the wall above the fireplace. The slight tilt remained. Miss Marple stepped closer, examining the edge of the frame. A tiny smudge, barely visible but fresh, marked the wall. Someone had adjusted the painting recently, but why? She reached behind the frame and felt a rough patch of plaster. It was slightly recessed. She tapped it with her knuckle, and the hollow sound confirmed it. There had once been a small hiding place there, long sealed, perhaps years ago, or recently disturbed. She made no move to open it further. Instead, she left the library and requested Finch meet her in the drawing room. The butler arrived quickly, still upright and composed, though something in his eyes had changed. Resignation, perhaps, or weariness that had finally taken hold. Miss Marple offered him tea, then sat opposite him in the same chair from which she had observed so many of the case's turns. "Mr. Finch," she began gently, "you knew Miss Blythe had accessed old family letters." "Yes," he replied. "She often asked me for key collections. I obliged." "Did you know she had taken any of them off the premises?" Finch hesitated. "She claimed she needed to make copies. I didn't interfere." Miss Marple nodded, thoughtfully. "And did you ever see her handle anything addressed to Daniel?" "I did. Once. A letter she said was of no consequence. She said it was too personal to archive. She didn't destroy it." "No," Finch admitted. "She kept it in her bag. I assumed she meant to return it to Daniel in time." Miss Marple leaned in, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly. "She didn't. She hid it, as if she feared what it might say. And that, Mr. Finch, is what concerns me. Because if she had seen the contents and believed them, she might not have acted as she did." Finch's brow creased. "I don't understand." "Then let me try something unconventional," she said softly, rising and retrieving a small silver box from the hallway. It was a game set, a chessboard Sir Geoffrey had once used, its pieces delicately carved and rarely touched. She placed it between them on the table and began setting up the pieces. Finch watched silently as she moved through the ritual. When all was ready, she gestured to the White King. Let's suppose Geoffrey is this king, surrounded, pressured, on all sides. The Queen, Miss Blythe, thinks herself righteous and moves to trap him, but she never checks the knight hiding in the corner. She tapped the Black Knight. Finch said nothing. The knight doesn't move often, rarely at all, but it sees everything from an angle others don't expect. Miss Marple slid the knight forward, toppling the White King with a soft click. Finch's eyes flicked to the board, then to Miss Marple's face. I believe, she said calmly, Miss Blythe wrote the forged letter, but someone else placed it. Someone who understood what it would provoke. Someone who wanted her to act. Finch's silence deepened. You knew she found the real letter. But when she hesitated to use it, you presented her with an easier version. Something that could serve as both a spark and a shield. Something that made her look like the sole architect. Finch's voice was a whisper. She wanted justice. She wanted clarity, Miss Marple corrected. But she was also vulnerable, easy to steer. You handed her a knife, but you kept your own. Hands clean. Finch rose slowly, his hands trembling. He destroyed her, Miss Marple, Geoffrey. He lied to Annabel, trapped her, made her think she was unloved. And I stood by, watched it all unfold in silence. I swore I would never lift a hand against him. But when Miss Blythe arrived, digging, speaking Annabel's name again, I saw a way. You used her, Miss Marple said quietly but firmly. I gave her a nudge, Finch said. She did the rest. Did you know she would go that far? I hoped she wouldn't. But I knew she might. Miss Marple stared at him, her heart heavy. And the letter, you read it, the real one. Finch nodded. It absolved him, said she had forgiven him, that she understood, even said she loved him still. That would have ruined everything Miss Blythe believed. So you hid it. Yes. He sat again, deflated, the weight of years pressing into his spine. Miss Marple gently closed the chessboard. You didn't strike the blow, but you crafted the board. Later that afternoon, Finch was brought in without struggle. Inspector Cornish said nothing during the formalities. No handcuffs, no shouting. Just quiet acknowledgement. Miss Blythe, still in custody, had confessed all she knew, but now at last the final player was seen. Miss Marple, alone again in the library as evening drew its long shadows, took out Annabel's sealed letter. She would send it to Daniel, not with explanations, not with apologies, only with the truth, as Annabel had written it, untouched by the hands of grief or vengeance. The crime had been born from silence, festered in guilt, and fed by misplaced loyalty. But in the end, it was a single move, calculated and quiet, that had turned justice into manipulation. And it had taken an unconventional strategy, one shaped not by logic alone, but by human fallibility to bring it to light. The next morning the snowfall ceased, leaving behind a silvery quiet over Elderbury Hall. Ice clung to the trees, and the garden paths glistened in the pale light. Inside, however, the air had grown taut with unspoken tension. Inspector Cornish had taken Finch into custody without fanfare, and though it hadn't been made public, word travelled quickly in villages like St. Aldhelm's Hollow. The household staff moved about with more deliberate care, unsure of whom to trust. Even the walls seemed to listen now. Miss Marple remained at the hall, invited by Cornish to assist as the investigation reached its final stages. The truth was, no longer a question of guilt alone. It had become a matter of intention, of layers peeled back and motives re-evaluated. Yet with Finch's quiet confession, Miss Marple had believed they were finally approaching the core of the matter. That belief faltered when she went to retrieve the original letter, the one addressed to Daniel in Annabel's hand, and found it gone. It had been secured in her personal handbag, placed inside a sealed envelope, and left in the locked sitting room she had been using. The bag itself remained untouched in appearance, but the envelope had been removed with deliberate care. There were no torn seams, no rummaged papers. Whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were looking for. She said nothing immediately, choosing instead to sit calmly in the same chair where so many pieces of this mystery had been puzzled together. Her face betrayed no alarm, but inside her mind, threads snapped taut. That letter was the one irrefutable piece of truth left in the storm of accusations and manipulations. Its contents didn't simply humanize Annabel, they rewrote the very foundation of the crime. Its disappearance meant someone still had something to lose. Inspector Cornish was summoned quietly, and upon hearing the news, his first reaction was a look of contained disbelief. "But it was in your possession," he said. "Who would even know it existed?" "Finch did," Miss Marple replied. "So did I. And now, whoever took it either wanted to destroy it or use it," Cornish paced. "We've accounted for all the staff. No one's entered that room except you and me. And the only other person still present in the hall is Daniel," Miss Marple finished gently. "He returned. He never truly left," she said. "His luggage was sent to the train station yesterday, but he never boarded. I asked the porter this morning discreetly. Daniel stayed behind, quietly, watching." Cornish's eyes narrowed. "But why?" Perhaps he wanted to understand the ending of the story. Perhaps he suspected there was more. Or perhaps he read the letter after all, and realized it undid everything he believed. "But we never gave it to him," Cornish said. "No," Miss Marple said softly. "But what if someone else did?" The thought settled heavily between them. If Finch, in one last moment of conscience, had delivered the letter before his arrest, then Daniel might have read words that reframed everything. Words that showed Annabel did not blame Geoffrey. Words that might make Daniel question everything, Miss Blythe and Finch had said. And if he did not want those words known, if he feared the loss of a narrative that had justified a lifetime of bitterness, then he had reason to make them disappear. Cornish ordered the hall secured again, all comings and goings logged by constables. Yet by midday a second alarm was raised. The drawer in Sir Geoffrey's personal study, where the audio recorder had been stored, was found open and empty. The device too had vanished. Miss Marple stood at the threshold of the study, eyes scanning the room, not for the missing object, but for what it told her. Someone was dismantling the truth piece by piece. First the letter, now the recording. Together, they told a version of Geoffrey not as a cruel tyrant, but as a man full of remorse and human weakness. If someone needed him to remain the villain, someone like Daniel, then the evidence of his humanity had to go. The pieces began rearranging themselves in Miss Marple's mind. Daniel had always kept himself half in shadow, just emotional enough to seem earnest, just removed enough to avoid suspicion. And in the wake of Miss Blythe's confession, he had not expressed outrage or grief. He had vanished for a day, and now the crucial evidence was gone. She asked to see Daniel. He was found in the rear gardens, leaning against the stone balustrade beneath the dead wisteria vines. His hands were gloveless despite the cold, his fingers red from the wind. When he turned and saw Miss Marple approach, his face shifted, something between resignation and fatigue. "You're still here," he said. "As are you," she replied, matching his calm tone. "Even though your train left yesterday." He smiled faintly. "I missed it," she studied him. "And I suppose you've had time to consider what the letter said." His expression didn't flicker. "What letter?" "The one Annabel wrote to you. Her real words, not the ones others created." He looked away toward the woods. "I never saw it." "That would be easier to believe if it weren't missing." Along with the recording of Geoffrey's final dictation. Silence. Miss Marple stepped closer. "You knew Miss Blythe had been manipulated, that Finch used her as a tool to settle his old grievances. But when you heard her confession, you didn't offer sympathy. You didn't offer anger either. You disappeared, and when you returned, the truth began to vanish." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What if the truth doesn't matter anymore?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but steady. "Then why are you still here?" He exhaled through his nose, a cloud of frost. "Because I don't know what to do with what I read." "So you did read it?" He gave a tired nod. "Finch passed it to me just before he was arrested. Told me I deserved to know the truth. I opened it in the carriage outside the station. I read every word, and suddenly everything made less sense. She forgave Geoffrey. She still loved him. She pitied me, not in cruelty but in sorrow." "And that frightened you?" Miss Marple said. "No," he whispered. "It emptied me. I'd held on to my pain like it was proof that I mattered, that she had belonged to me, even in memory. But her words, kind and soft, left me with nothing to rage against." Miss Marple let the silence settle, then asked, "Where is the letter now?" "I burned it." "And the recording?" He looked down at his raw hands. "I threw it into the stream near the woods." Miss Marple did not flinch. "You destroyed the evidence not to protect yourself, but to protect the grief you'd come to depend on." Daniel didn't respond. She didn't press him further. She simply turned and walked back toward the house, her footsteps crisp on the gravel. When she reached the door, she paused and looked back. "Grief becomes a part of us when we have nothing left to hold," she said softly. "But if it's built on lies, it doesn't anchor us. It buries us." Daniel remained still, snow beginning to fall around him once more. Inside, Miss Marple returned to the now empty drawer and laid her gloved hand gently over it. The truth had been found and lost within a single day. But not all was gone. Some truths, once uncovered, remain even without their proof. And Miss Marple, ever the quiet custodian of such truths, would carry them onward. The sky over Elderbury darkened earlier than expected that evening, thick clouds rolling in low over the treetops. A damp chill clung to the walls of the hall, the kind that seeped in through stone and lingered in the joints. Most of the household had retired early, the events of the past few days leaving everyone drained. Inspector Cornish had stationed a constable at the main door as a precaution. Though the case appeared resolved in most eyes, he had learned enough from Miss Marple to remain cautious. The vanishing of both the letter and the recording had unsettled him. The confessions had filled gaps, but the absence of physical evidence kept the truth suspended like breath in cold air. Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room after dinner, seated near the fire with her knitting idle in her lap. She was not at peace. The fire crackled gently beside her, yet she felt a hollowness in the air, as if the house itself were waiting. Her thoughts circled around Daniel's quiet devastation, the fragile line between justice and vengeance, and the things people destroyed not to escape guilt, but to preserve it. She had hoped, after speaking with Daniel, that the storm had passed. But storms often had a second wave. A knock came at the door. It was Finch's voice, urgent and low. "Miss Marple, please." She rose quickly, startled by the voice. Finch had been in custody. Cornish had taken him personally. And yet there he stood in the hallway, wet from rain, his overcoat clinging to his shoulders. "I had to come," he said, voice shaking. "They let me speak with the vicar. I told him everything. I confessed. But then someone slipped me this." He held out a folded piece of paper, creased and smudged. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside was a single line, typed. "You missed 1." There was no signature, no date. She looked up. "Where did you get this?" "I found it tucked into the inside of my coat after the vicar left. I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't there when I changed earlier." Miss Marple turned the note over. It was typed on the same style of paper used in the hall's library. And the typeface matched the library's old Remington. She stepped past him into the hallway. "Come. We must speak with Cornish at once." But before they reached the stairs, a scream rang through the hall. Sharp, female, then silence. Miss Marple froze, her eyes darting toward the upper corridor. Finch turned without a word and ran ahead. She followed as swiftly as her steps allowed, mounting the stairs 2 at a time. The constable stationed near the bedrooms appeared from the far end, already heading toward the source of the scream, Miss Blythe's room. They reached the door together. Finch pushed it open. Miss Blythe was gone. The bed was undisturbed, the window slightly ajar. A single slipper lay on the rug, its pair missing. Her coat was gone from the hook. The lamp beside the bed still glowed softly. Miss Marple moved quickly to the window and peered out. Below was the narrow back path that led through the trees toward the stream, barely visible in the growing dark, but possible to navigate. She turned to the constable. "Alert Inspector Cornish immediately and search the stream. She's not gone far." He nodded and ran off. Finch stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale. "I don't understand," he murmured. "She was under guard." "She was clever," Miss Marple said. "Cleverer than we gave her credit for." He turned to her. "But I thought she was used, by me. She believed she was delivering justice. That's what you said." Miss Marple shook her head. "She believed in the story, yes, but not blindly. Not fully. That note, you missed one, wasn't a warning to you. It was to her. A message, and she understood it." Finch's eyes narrowed. "Then who sent it?" "The one who's been silent all along," she said quietly. "The one who never came forward, never made a scene, never gave an alibi because they never needed to, because we never suspected them." They both turned as Cornish arrived, breathless, followed by a second constable with a flashlight. Miss Marple quickly explained the disappearance. Cornish's jaw set. "We'll find her." But as they moved outside and fanned out across the grounds, the search led not to the stream, but to the greenhouse behind the western hedges. A trail of footprints in the soft earth led there, and inside, Behind the rows of frost-covered pots, they found Miss Blythe, crumpled on the floor. Alive, but unconscious. A shallow cut bled from her forehead. A small black paperweight, won from Sir Geoffrey's study, lay nearby. She had been struck from behind. Miss Marple moved quickly, checking her pulse. "She'll live," she said. But someone didn't want her to disappear. They wanted her silenced. Cornish nodded grimly. "We were wrong. This wasn't over." They carried her back to the hall, placing her in the care of the house nurse. Miss Marple stayed at her, sighed as she stirred faintly, whispering something inaudible. Her eyes opened briefly. "Library. Desk drawer." Miss Marple stood at once and turned to Cornish. "She left something. She was going to tell us who gave her that note." They moved quickly to the library. Cornish opened the drawer. Inside was a single photograph, aged but clear. It showed Sir Geoffrey seated beside a much younger man, a hand on his shoulder. Daniel, but not alone. Behind them stood a third figure, half in shadow, Miss Blythe. Only it wasn't recent. It was from nearly 20 years earlier. The handwriting on the back read, "Daniel, Geoffrey and Eleanor, Elderbury Garden, 1931. Cornish stared. "Eleanor? Blythe?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. She wasn't just the historian. She was family, or near enough to it. She hid her identity. She didn't need to announce it, Miss Marple said, and no one here remembered. But she was there, long before the rest of us. Perhaps she loved Geoffrey. Perhaps she loved Daniel. But she was more than a researcher. She was a witness, and someone else knew. Cornish turned the photo over again. "You think someone tried to kill her because she was about to confess?" "No," Miss Marple said, "because she was about to name them. The one person who stayed quiet, who never revealed their knowledge of this photo, the one who, typed the letter, who planted the forged message, who stirred the resentment in others without ever acting openly." Cornish asked. "Who?" Miss Marple stepped back, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one who knew everything because he saw everything. Not Finch, not Daniel. Someone who was always present, who blended in so well. We never thought twice." Her eyes narrowed. "The constable," she said, "the one stationed upstairs." Cornish's expression darkened. "You think he—" "I think we need to find him. Now." But by the time they reached the upper corridor, he was gone. Uniform hung neatly on the chair. No sign of forced exit. Just the open door and the echo of footsteps already long vanished into the cold night. The villain, it seemed, had been several steps ahead after all. And now he was free. The discovery of the missing constable's empty uniform sent a ripple of unease through the entire estate. The man's name, Clive Hargreaves, had appeared ordinary on the roster, and his service record bore no alarming notes. But as Inspector Cornish reviewed the personnel files that night by the study fire, with Miss Marple seated quietly nearby, the sense that they had all been manipulated deepened. Hargreaves hadn't just vanished. He had never truly arrived. His paperwork had passed through the usual channels, his badge and identification accepted without question, but no one remembered the exact moment he entered the house. He had been there like a shadow, always one step behind the main players, never drawing attention. And now he was gone, having left behind a near-dead woman and a photograph that no one should have remembered existed. Miss Blythe remained unconscious, but stable, under careful watch. Daniel, shaken by the new violence, had taken to the drawing room and had barely spoken since. Finch, still in custody, had nothing more to offer, and Henry Carraway remained locked in a bitter silence in the nearby station, now distant from the truth he had once hoped to control. Yet despite the mounting confusion, Miss Marple had begun to feel a quiet certainty pressing at the edges of her thoughts. Something was beginning to make sense. Not everything, but something. She sat with her tea cooling beside her, reviewing again the photograph of Geoffrey, Daniel, and the woman identified as Eleanor. It had been taken in the elderberry garden, a scene now hushed in memory. The background showed the roses in bloom, a sundial in the distance and the faint outline of the greenhouse. She stared at it long, eyes drawn not to the figures but to the objects. Then she turned to Cornish. "Do you recall the paperweight found beside Miss Blythe?" "Yes," he said. "From Geoffrey's study. Heavy brass. Odd thing to carry around." "But it wasn't in the study when I visited that morning," she said. "I remember it wasn't on the desk. I noticed a round mark on the blotter where something had once sat. The paperweight had already been taken." Cornish frowned. "Taken by Hargreaves, or someone else who knew it had been used in the past. Perhaps even by Geoffrey himself. Do we know how long that paperweight has been missing from the study?" Cornish checked the evidence log. "It was last seen 3 days before Geoffrey's death. Mrs. Herring said she'd moved it to dust, but when she returned it later, it was already gone." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then it was removed intentionally, not for convenience, but for staging. To be used as a weapon, perhaps, or a prop." Cornish looked up. "But we know it was used on Miss Blythe." "Yes," she said, "but the question is, was it intended to kill or to silence temporarily?" He paused. "If it were meant to kill, the blow would have been stronger." Miss Marple stood and moved to the fireplace, lifting the photograph again. This woman, Eleanor. She was younger then, obviously, but her eyes, her posture, not just an observer, she belonged to the scene. And that brings me back to the letter Annabel wrote. The original one, not the forged version. In it, she mentioned Daniel and Geoffrey, but never Eleanor. Yet Eleanor was clearly present in the family's inner circle. "You believe Annabel omitted her deliberately?" "I believe Eleanor was not merely a historian with a passion for truth. She was someone who had once mattered and then disappeared into silence. And silence breeds resentment when left unchecked." Cornish turned over the photo. "But Eleanor died, didn't she?" "Long ago?" Miss Marple's voice softened. "What if she didn't?" Cornish stared. "You're saying Miss Blythe and Eleanor Carraway were the same person?" She claimed her full name was Eleanor Margaret Blythe. Margaret was Emily's middle name, Geoffrey's sister. The same Emily who once wrote the letter that revealed Geoffrey's lies. That thread connects. Miss Blythe arrived here as a historian, but she stayed for something more. She knew the family intimately because she was part of it. But why hide that? To control the narrative. To guide the discovery at her own pace. She needed to be perceived as impartial to be believed. Had she come forward as a long-lost cousin or bitter relative, no one would have trusted her findings. Instead, she became the archivist of Geoffrey's sins. Cornish exhaled. And if Hargreaves found that out, he would have known her vulnerability, Miss Marple said, that she was already on the edge of revealing too much. He wasn't just removing obstacles, He was managing the truth. Cornish folded his arms. So who is he? That's the final thread, she said. And the answer lies not in the people, but in the pattern. She moved toward the desk and opened the top drawer. Do you recall the dictation machine? Yes. Destroyed. Daniel admitted it. Only the recording was destroyed. The machine itself was never found. She retrieved a small notebook. Sir Geoffrey's old shorthand. Log. Geoffrey kept a meticulous record of his recordings. They were numbered. And here, she pointed, entry 47, marked with a circle. Cornish looked. What's that mean? Geoffrey only marked special recordings, those he didn't trust to store publicly. Entry 47 includes a note. Clive, discuss garden. Gate installation, 3 visitors. Midnight meeting. Record and archive separately. Cornish's eyes widened. Clive, the same name as the constable. Too rare a coincidence, Miss Marple said. I believe Clive Hargreaves was never a real constable at all. He was Geoffrey's groundsman once years ago, let go quietly after a dispute. But he remained nearby, watching. He returned under false credentials, slipped into the investigation. Cornish's voice dropped. And killed Geoffrey? Miss Marple shook her head. No, but he knew what Miss Blythe had done. And when Finch confessed, when Daniel fell silent, Clive saw his chance to erase them all. The forgeries, the recording, even the historical record. He needed the truth buried again. Cornish closed the notebook and turned toward the window. Then he's still out there. Yes, Miss Marple said, and he knows we've begun to see it. Cornish looked back at her. Then what do we do? She walked to the doorway, calm and deliberate. We let the pattern finish drawing itself. He's writing the ending he thinks no one can stop. We just have to be there when the ink dries. The wind had picked up again by nightfall, howling, softly through the chimney and rattling the loose panes in the upper hallway windows. The snow that had melted during the day had turned to slush, and a grey mist clung low to the ground. Inside Elderbury Hall, however, the world had narrowed. Inspector Cornish, now operating with wary precision, had ordered all remaining doors locked from the inside and stationed a verified constable, this time thoroughly background-checked at every entrance. The staff moved in silence, their footsteps measured, eyes darting toward shadows, and Miss Marple sat once more in the drawing-room, unmoving but deeply alert. She stared into the fireplace where the flames crackled gently, not for warmth now, but for steadiness. She had asked Cornish to bring the old visitor logs from the estate, not the recent ones, but those kept nearly 2 decades earlier. And now, with spectacles perched low on her nose, she flipped through each page with patient exactitude, following a trail that had gone cold long before Geoffrey's death. Beside her, Cornish paced slowly. You're sure about the name? Clive, Miss Marple said without looking up. Mentioned in the shorthand log and again in that photo. A presence in Geoffrey's life, never explained. The staff say he was dismissed after a quarrel. But there's no record of that quarrel, not in the employment ledgers, not in the family correspondence. Maybe it was a quiet dismissal. That, she said, would have been unusual for Geoffrey. He was a man who believed in documentation. His cruelty was often administrative. Cornish frowned. So why hide it? She turned a page and froze. Here. Clive Harrow, summer guest, lodged 3 nights, access granted to West Garden, recommendation by Miss Emily Carraway. Harrow? Cornish repeated. Not Hargreaves. Miss Marple's eyes stayed on the page. An alias. Harrow is closer to the truth. Geoffrey must have changed it in the shorthand log, deliberately obscuring the link. But Emily brought him. Emily, the sister who wrote the letter exposing Geoffrey's betrayal of Annabel. The sister who died not long after this entry. You think it's the same man? I think it's more than that. I think Clive Harrow wasn't just a visitor. He was Emily's son. Cornish blinked. Her son? Yes. And not acknowledged publicly. Likely born during her brief engagement to that vicar, Thomas Archer. He died suddenly, didn't he, before they married? And she disappeared from society for nearly a year. When she returned, no mention of the child. Cornish sank into a chair. So she gave birth in secret, raised the boy quietly, then brought him here briefly. And Geoffrey? Miss Marple nodded. Whatever happened during that visit, it ended badly. Geoffrey must have rejected him, perhaps even threatened to cut Emily off if she insisted on integrating the boy into the family. From that moment, Clive wasn't simply excluded, he was erased, and Geoffrey ensured no trace of him remained in the family records. Cornish looked toward the window. So Clive Harrow became Clive Hargreaves, changed his name, disappeared, and then came back. Decades later, Miss Marple said, armed with knowledge of the past and a motive far deeper than revenge. Cornish turned to her. Not revenge? No, she said softly. Recognition. Cornish waited. Clive was never seeking destruction for its own sake. He didn't want money. He never went near the inheritance. He didn't sabotage the estate's reputation or seek public scandal. He orchestrated a story. Carefully, meticulously. He planted the forged letter. He encouraged Finch's guilt. He let Miss Blythe believe she was avenging a love story. He even watched as Daniel unravelled himself with grief. Every move served one purpose, to rewrite the narrative that erased him. Cornish leaned forward. He wanted his mother remembered. Yes, Miss Marple said, and more than that, he wanted Geoffrey's legacy restructured so thoroughly that no one could tell the Carroway story without encountering Clive. Even if his name never appeared, the shape of the story would bear his influence. Geoffrey's death, the letter, the confession, the fracture of the family name. Clive made himself the architect of it all, because in doing so, he proved he had always been part of it. And Miss Blythe, she wasn't just a tool. She was his mirror. Another invisible thread in the Carroway family folded into the background. He saw in her a parallel, and so he gave her the narrative she craved. A tragedy she could mend, a role she could play. He made her feel powerful, and when she was no longer useful, he silenced her. Gently, almost pityingly, but not fatally, because even that gesture, sparing her, fit his story. Cornish stood and crossed to the window, jaw tight. So the violence was never rage, it was choreography. Miss Marple closed the visitor log gently. Exactly. Clive wasn't content to punish Geoffrey. He wanted to unwrite him, and in his place, leave a memory crafted by his own hand. Cornish turned back, voice low. So how do we find him? She stood. By understanding his next move. Cornish nodded. He'll return to the garden. Yes, she said. That's where the photo was taken, where Emily brought him, where Geoffrey first rejected him. That is where he began, and where he will try to end it. An hour later, under a pale moon and breathless wind, the constables moved out across the grounds. Miss Marple, flanked by Cornish and a lantern-bearing officer, walked slowly toward the stone bench by the sundial in the western garden. The trees whispered above them. There, on the far edge of the lawn, near the hedges where the wisteria once bloomed, a figure stood. He did not run. Clive Harrow stood with his hands by his sides, his expression unreadable. He looked older now, the shadows revealing tiredness beneath the anger. His gaze found Miss Marple first, then Cornish. "You know." "It now," he said. "We do," Miss Marple replied. He gave a slow nod, as if relieved. "I didn't want to kill him. I didn't need to. He was already empty. But I needed his ending to fit the truth, the one he never let exist." Cornish stepped forward. "You manipulated half a dozen people. You stole evidence, assaulted a woman, nearly pushed an innocent man into confession." "No," Clive interrupted, voice sharp. "I gave them what they were already holding. I didn't invent guilt. I uncovered it." Cornish raised his hand, and the constables closed in. Miss Marple, her voice quiet, said, "Your mother would have loved you anyway." Clive looked at her, eyes finally softening. "She did. Once. And then, without struggle, he let them take him." The truth had emerged, not loud, not violent, but intricate, woven through silence and memory. And in the end, the crime had never been about the man who died, but the boy no one saw. The night held its breath as Clive Harrow was led through the garden by torchlight, his steps steady, his silence absolute. The wind had died down and the frost underfoot crunched softly, almost respectfully. He didn't resist. He didn't speak further. It was as if surrendering had been his final move in a long and deliberate strategy. But for Miss Marple, who watched him from a quiet distance as the constables took him inside, something still hovered just out of reach. Not the truth, she knew that now in full, but the balance. And Clive, for all his complexity, hadn't tipped it yet. Inside Elderbury Hall, the rooms had grown strangely quiet. The house, once crackling with tension, was subdued now, stunned into stillness. But Miss Marple moved with calm intent, bypassing the drawing room and heading instead toward the library. Cornish followed, saying nothing, sensing she had not yet finished. She asked that Clive be held temporarily in the old estate office at the back of the house, where he would not be seen or disturbed until dawn. Then, without waiting for confirmation, she lit the lamp in the library and sat once more by Geoffrey's desk. There she placed the photograph, the one of Geoffrey, Daniel, and Eleanor, flat on the surface, and beside it, the remaining logs and letters connected to Emily Carroway. She spread them like pieces of a puzzle not yet completed. Cornish finally spoke. "What are we waiting for?" She looked up. "For him to come back. One last time." "I thought we caught him." "No," she said gently. "We didn't. We caught Clive Harrow. But not the man who made him necessary." Cornish hesitated. "You mean Geoffrey?" "I mean someone else entirely." And as if on cue, a soft creak sounded at the hallway door. A shadow stretched into the room, thin, deliberate, patient, and then Daniel stepped in. His coat was buttoned, his hair neatly combed. There was no surprise in his face, only resignation. "I thought it would be over now," he said. Miss Marple gestured to the chair across from her. "I think you knew it wouldn't be." He sat without protest. Cornish moved behind him but said nothing. You let Clive believe he was writing the final chapter, Miss Marple said softly. And he believed it, because you needed him to. Daniel's eyes didn't flinch. I didn't plan it that way. But you adjusted, didn't you? When the forged letter surfaced, when the will was altered, when Finch broke, each moment, you let it move forward. You didn't start the fire, but you certainly didn't stop it. I didn't need to, Daniel said. They all did what they were supposed to. I just let the past correct itself. No, Miss Marple said. You steered it. She pushed the photograph across the table. Eleanor was your aunt, Emily your grandmother, Clive your cousin. Daniel nodded, unspoken, but yes. And you knew all along. You knew who Clive was when he returned. You knew what he wanted. I recognized him the moment I saw him during the garden inspection. He was disguised, but the face was familiar. I said nothing. I watched. Miss Marple leaned in. You gave him room to act because it served you. Daniel's fingers laced tightly. Geoffrey destroyed every bond in this family. He lied to Annabel. He cut Finch out of everything. He erased Clive. He mocked Eleanor and buried Emily's warnings. And in the end, he tried to play the penitent man, but only once. It was too late for anyone to answer back, so you let others carry out your anger. I let them tell their stories, he said. Finch told his. Eleanor told hers, even Clive. But me, I stayed silent. And silence lets the guilty think they're safe. Cornish stepped forward. And Miss Blythe, you let her walk into danger. I warned her to stop digging. Quietly, I left notes. But she didn't stop. And Clive used her. I didn't know he would go that far. You did, Miss Marple said softly. You were always watching. Daniel looked to her now, and for the first time, there was no coldness in his expression, only a kind of worn honesty. I wanted to confront Geoffrey. I waited. But when I saw the forged letter, when I saw how rattled he became, I knew the end had already begun. And when he died, well, I suppose I thought the past was finally quiet. But it wasn't, she said, because it still lived in you. A long silence stretched between them. Then Miss Marple leaned back and her tone softened. You know, Daniel, many people suffer at the hands of cruel men, but not all of them turn cruelty into a mirror. You used others because you didn't want to do the violence yourself, but you orchestrated enough of it, and now Clive will hang for it, even though you were holding the script. Daniel's voice dropped. What would you have me do? Confess? Say I wanted him dead? I would have you acknowledge the role you played, she said, because the law may stop at Clive, but the truth doesn't. And the truth, if not spoken aloud, festers. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then speak it. Miss Marple looked to Cornish, who stood with quiet authority. Cornish stepped forward. Daniel Carraway, you are not under arrest yet. But I advise you not to leave this house until a formal statement can be taken. And I advise you to think very carefully about what story you want told next. Daniel stood. For a moment he looked like he might argue, but then something softened in his stance. He looked at the photograph again. His eyes rested on the background, the sundial, the greenhouse, the life before it all came apart. I'll stay, he said. He left the room quietly. Cornish turned to Miss Marple. You always knew, didn't you? She folded her hands gently. I always suspected. But tonight, I needed to see what Daniel would do when the play was over and the audience gone. Cornish looked at the fire, now burning low. "And what did he do?" she answered softly. "He stayed. That's how you know the last chapter is ready to be written." The dawn that broke over Elderbury Hall was a pale one, barely pushing the mist back from the fields. Inside the great house, a hollow stillness had taken root. The events of the previous night had left the household in a cautious limbo. Clive, Harrow in custody, Daniel Carroway seated silently in the study, awaiting formal questioning, and Miss Marple, in her usual quiet corner of the drawing-room, absorbing the aftermath like one sifting the residue from a long storm. Inspector Cornish had begun the paperwork to close the case, his voice weary but certain. And yet, even as the pieces lay seemingly in place, something fragile within the puzzle had yet to settle. It came not in a dramatic entrance or a new confession, but as a whisper, almost an afterthought, tucked into the ordinary. Mrs. Herring, the housekeeper, brought in tea as she always did, setting the tray down with practiced care. But her brow furrowed faintly as she placed a folded newspaper atop the table. "This morning's paper from the village, ma'am," she said to Miss Marple. "Strange thing. It was already in the vestibule before I left to fetch it. As though someone delivered it early." Miss Marple glanced down, distracted at first. Then her eyes caught on a single small headline beneath the fold: "Local solicitor found dead in apparent suicide." Cornish, reading over her shoulder, blinked. Henry Carroway. Miss Marple's lips parted, but she said nothing yet. I read the accompanying line carefully. "Body found at family estate. Note recovered. Authorities treating death as self-inflicted." Cornish stepped back. "But he was in custody, transferred just last night to the regional office." Miss Marple closed the paper slowly. "Transferred, not supervised." Cornish exhaled. "He was released after Finch's full confession." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He was considered irrelevant. A man cut out of the will. Petty, perhaps bitter, but not dangerous. And yet—" Cornish paced. "This doesn't fit." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the thinning mist across the garden. For the first time, there was hesitation in her step. Not uncertainty, Miss Marple never doubted her reasoning, but something subtler. A recognition that the pattern she had accepted may have been built atop a carefully shaped illusion. She returned to the photograph on the library desk. Geoffrey, Daniel, Eleanor. But her eyes now moved to a second, slightly blurred object in the background. Not the sundial. Not the greenhouse. A mailbox. She turned back to Cornish. "How far does the post reach from the village?" He frowned. "It's collected by bicycle courier in the morning. Rural circuit. Why?" If Henry was dead by nightfall, and the body discovered just this morning, how was the paper with that headline already at the house? Cornish stiffened. "You think the newspaper was planted?" "No," she said. "I think it was prepared." She took the paper again and examined the edges. No moisture, no signs of folding beyond the one crease. Delivered precisely, not by post, but by hand, and by someone who wanted it seen. "Cornish," she said softly, "have the constables confirmed Clive Harrow's cell? Is he still in holding?" Cornish didn't answer. He turned and left at once. Miss Marple remained, her fingers resting on the photograph. Then she crossed to the fireplace, pulled the poker from its iron loop, and stirred the ash gently. Something caught on the edge, a piece of scorched parchment, brittle but partly legible. She removed it with the tongs, placed it on the hearth, and examined it closely. A letterhead from Geoffrey's personal stationery. Only a few words survived. Daniel knew. Eleanor never should have. She paused. The ink had bled with the heat, but the implication was clear. This was not a document meant to be read. It had been meant to vanish. Cornish returned moments later, breath short. "He's gone," he said. "Clive. They checked an hour ago. Empty. Cell. The door was locked, but the keys were found on the floor. No sign of forced exit." Miss Marple didn't look surprised. He was never going to wait for justice. "But how?" "He had help," she said, "and not from Daniel." Cornish stiffened. "You think Henry let him out?" "I think Henry never intended to die." Cornish stepped closer. "The body, not confirmed. Described. Found near the Carraway estate, but no identification offered in the report." "And what if the note wasn't from Henry? What if it was planted with just enough truth to suggest guilt and just enough mystery to suggest closure?" Cornish's voice dropped. "You're saying Clive and Henry were working together?" Miss Marple turned to him. "Henry had the motive to kill Geoffrey. His place in the will had vanished. His legacy was erased. But he lacked the boldness. Clive had the drive, but not the resources. What they shared was a single enemy, Geoffrey Carraway. And when the estate began to crack, they used the chaos like master dramatists." Cornish stood frozen. Miss Marple added, "The letter in the fireplace. It was written by Geoffrey, likely addressed to his solicitor. He suspected something. Perhaps about Henry. Perhaps about Clive. He may have planned to amend the will again, or expose both men, but someone got to it first." Cornish spoke slowly. "You think they burned the letter?" Framed the narrative, orchestrated every confession that followed. They knew Finch's guilt could be provoked. They knew Miss Blythe's obsession could be weaponized. Daniel's grief could be left to curdle. They didn't create every wound, but they applied pressure to the ones already open. And the forged letter from Annabel? Planted. By Clive, yes, but with Henry's guidance. He would have known where the stationery was kept, how Geoffrey's typewriter was aligned. Clive carried it out. Henry polished it. Cornish let out a breath. And now they vanished. Miss Marple nodded. Together, or apart. But one thing is certain. Clive is free, and Henry was never dead. Outside, the morning light brightened against the frosted lawn, casting sharp shadows from the sundial. Miss Marple turned from the window and picked up her gloves. "We mustn't think of this as a closed case," she said. "We must think of it as the beginning of a new one." Cornish looked at her. "And where do we start?" She glanced back at the fireplace where the letter fragment continued to curl in the ash. Then she looked toward the west garden, where the photo had been taken, the very origin of the story they had all followed. "We start," she said, "where the lie began, because that's where the truth has gone to hide." The west garden of Elderbury Hall still wore its winter hush, branches stiff with frost, and the sundial cast a sharp crescent of shadow over the gravel. The scene from the old photograph now looked like a memorial. No longer just a garden, but the site of something foundational. Something that had been buried beneath decades of silence and bitter rearrangements. Miss Marple stood in its centre, turning slowly, observing not what was present, but what had been removed. The symmetry Geoffrey had once demanded of his estate was no longer intact. The family tree had rotted from its roots. But even in decay, it left its patterns behind. Cornish joined her, his coat damp from the frost. "We've put out a regional alert. No word yet. If Clive and Henry are travelling together, they've made careful use of the hours we lost. They've had years to prepare," Miss Marple said, her eyes sweeping the hedges. "Their paths only crossed recently, perhaps, but their hatred of Geoffrey evolved in parallel, like twin strands of a cord never quite severed." Cornish hesitated. But why the elaborate performance? The false suicide? The staged clues? Even the manipulation of Daniel and Finch? They had the motive. Why not strike directly? Miss Marple turned slowly, eyes focused not on Cornish but inward, through memory and logic. Because Geoffrey's death alone would not have satisfied them. They wanted control of the story. That's what vengeance becomes in the end, Inspector. Not fire, but authorship. She gestured toward the sundial. "Consider it. Geoffrey prided himself on legacy. The letters, the records, the endless documentation of his superiority. What better way to destroy him than not only to end his life, but to warp the memory of it, to let the people he humiliated carry the justice themselves, and then break under its weight." Cornish frowned. "But how did you know that Henry and Clive were working together?" She walked slowly toward the iron bench at the edge of the garden. "It began with something Finch said. When he confessed to hiding the photograph, he claimed it had been tucked into the Roman architecture book. But he said he hadn't placed it there. He assumed Miss Blythe had. Except Miss Blythe believed he had done so. It was a minor contradiction, passed off as forgetfulness. But the photo had to come from someone who had access to both Eleanor's records and a working knowledge of the estate library's layout." Cornish's brow furrowed. "So, not Finch, not Blythe." "Precisely," she said. "It was Henry. He knew where that photo was hidden because he took it from the archive weeks ago. He let it surface at the right time, knowing it would connect the past to the present, and that the emotional implications would be impossible to resist. He fed Finch's guilt, fed Miss Blythe's obsession, fed Daniel's resentment." Cornish exhaled. "And we all believed it. Because we were meant to," she said. "Because the truth wasn't simply hidden, it was reassembled." They walked in silence for a few paces before Cornish said, "So what's next?" Miss Marple glanced back toward the hall where the fires now burned lower and the windows had begun to fog. "Now we wait. Villains like Henry always believe in their own elegance. He will re-emerge eventually, once he feels the story has settled enough to rewrite it again. Men like him never stay gone. They need an audience." Cornish folded his arms. "And Clive?" "Clive," she paused. "Clive wanted recognition. That was the seed of it all. He didn't want to erase Geoffrey. He wanted to be acknowledged, beside him. I believe in some way he thought this would give his life shape. But now that Henry has used him and vanished, he may find himself less certain. We may see Clive before we see Henry again." Cornish nodded grimly. "If we're lucky, as—" They turned back toward the hall. A voice called from the upper path. A constable approached, carrying a plain, unmarked envelope. "Delivered by bicycle just now. No return address." Cornish took it and handed it to Miss Marple without a word. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, clean margins, no fingerprint smudges. "There are stories we bury because they shame us, and others because they were never ours to begin with. What matters is who gets to speak last. I have spoken, the rest is silence. No name." But Miss Marple knew the rhythm of Henry Carraway's voice when she saw it, even behind a machine. Cornish cursed under his breath. "He's taunting us." Miss Marple folded the paper precisely. "No, he's concluding. For now." Cornish frowned. "That's it? He gets away with it?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "He escapes, but he does not get away." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the hall. "You'll file your reports. The courts will archive this as an open investigation. But the people involved, Finch, Daniel, even poor Miss Blythe, they will carry the truth with them now. Not the one Henry tried to shape, but the one we uncovered. Quiet justice, Inspector. It doesn't always come with a trial. Sometimes it comes in the way people remember." Cornish looked toward the woods beyond the garden. "And what of you, Miss Marple?" She smiled, faintly, pulling her gloves on as the wind picked up. "I'll have my tea, and I'll make note of how even the cleverest story can't hide its author's hand forever." They returned inside as the first flakes of snow began to fall again, thin and slow, like the last words of a sentence no one could quite finish. Upstairs, Daniel sat by the window staring at the garden that had framed so much of his life. Finch stood in the hall polishing a banister he had wiped clean a dozen times already. And in the drawing room the fire still burned, lower now, but steady. Somewhere beyond the village 2 men were vanishing into shadow. But Elderbury Hall, stripped of its illusions, stood quietly in the light. Not victorious, but not fooled. Again. The air inside Elderbury Hall had settled into something close to peace, though it was not peace as one might know it. It was the stillness after reckoning, the kind that follows a storm that didn't tear the house down but shifted all. The furniture within. Fires were lit in the hearths again, not out of habit but because warmth was needed now. Real warmth, not the kind Geoffrey had once controlled with schedules and sharp comments. The estate stood unchanged from the outside, and yet something invisible within had realigned. Miss Marple took her coat from the stand by the entryway, the scent of wood polish lingering faintly on the cuffs. Inspector Cornish walked her to the door, reluctant but respectful. "You've done more than solve a case," he said quietly. "You've unstitched something that's held this place too tightly for too long." She gave him a soft smile. "We do what we can with the time we're given, and sometimes the most we can do is keep the fabric from tearing completely." Outside, the frost had returned to the grass in soft crystals, coating the steps and hedges like a veil. Miss Marple took the path slowly, not from fatigue but from thought. She passed the greenhouse, where the broken pane had been quietly replaced. She passed the sundial, its face wiped clean, though the shadow still fell in the same direction as it had all those years ago in the photograph. Daniel had not spoken again since their last conversation. He had remained in his room, sitting by the window as if waiting for something that could never arrive. Perhaps it was his mother's voice. Perhaps it was his own. At the gate, Finch waited. His uniform was gone now. He wore a plain coat and held a single suitcase, modest, worn, at the edges. He offered Miss Marple a nod as she approached. "They're letting me go," he said. "Cornish said I'd served my sentence long before I said a word." "You served too many, Mr. Finch," she replied gently. He gave a faint chuckle. "I never meant to be part of a story." "No," she said, "but you held one in silence. That takes more strength than people give credit for." He looked toward the hills, where the road curved into the trees. "Will you come back, Miss Marple?" If Elderbury needs you again. She didn't answer immediately. She turned and glanced, back toward the house. Something tugged at her then, lightly, subtly, like a thread at the hem of a garment. Perhaps, she said, and began to walk. But she had not gone more than 20 paces before a sound stopped her. A voice, small, unfamiliar, called her name from the gate. It belonged to a girl no older than 12, dark-haired, with smudged gloves and eyes too wide for her age. She carried something. A book, worn and bound in cracked leather. I think. This is yours, the girl said. I found it behind the bookshelf in the study. Papa said it must have been misplaced years ago. Miss Marple took the book carefully. It was old, unmarked. But as she opened it, she felt the breath catch in her throat. It was a ledger, not an account book, not personal notes, but a log of correspondence, names, dates, initials, and tucked near the back was a page that had never been turned before. Ink barely faded. A single entry, EC to MR. It must be done, she knows. If she speaks, all of it ends. Miss Marple read it again, slowly. EC Emily Carraway, MR. She paused, then ran her finger down the initials listed throughout the book. Most she didn't recognize, but the same two appeared a dozen times. One other caught her eye. LF. She flipped back to the first entry bearing those initials, MR to LF. Dispose of it. The girl cannot be trusted. Cornish had joined. Her now, reading over her shoulder. That's not Geoffrey, he said slowly. These aren't his initials. Miss Marple nodded. This isn't Geoffrey's ledger. She closed the book, holding it tightly. Cornish asked, Then whose is it? I don't know, she murmured, but someone kept a record. Someone watched from further back. And whoever MR was, they had more influence than we knew. He looked at her. You think there's more? She gave a quiet nod. Not with Henry, not with Clive. This goes deeper, a second ledger, a different story, running beneath the one we thought we'd solved. Cornish was silent. Miss Marple turned the book over, then handed it to him. Keep this safe, somewhere only you can find it. If you hear from me again, you'll know why. He took the book with both hands. You're not done, are you? No, Inspector, she said softly, stepping once more toward the road. Not yet. Behind her, the frost crunched again as she walked on, but this time it wasn't just the sound of her boots. Somewhere, in the forest beyond the hedges, another footfall echoed hers, light, uncertain, not yet close. A story watching from the trees, waiting for its moment to begin. And in the quiet that followed, Elderbury Hall stood, alone, no longer haunted by what had been, but by what had been missed.